Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending today's Student Voices webinar. We are currently letting everyone into the webinar, so give us a few seconds to get started, and then we'll jump right into today's discussion. Welcome, everyone. Give us a few seconds. We're going to jump right in. We're waiting for a couple more people to jump into the conversation. Thank you all for joining us today. We are excited to have this conversation with everyone. Our numbers are still going up, so we're going to wait just a few seconds. Thank you for everyone who is attending. So now let's try to meet each other in the chat. So as you're coming in, can you please share your name, your organization, and why you're attending today's Student Voices webinar in our chat? We're still having people join, but we want this to be a space where you all can connect and network. So please, in the chat, share your name, your organization. There are probably some people that you know who are already in the chat because education is a small world. Please connect and network with the folks that are here. And welcome. Thank you again for attending today. We are excited to have you all join us. Thank you for joining us today. We're still having some people jump into the conversation. We're going to wait a couple more minutes just to get started so everyone can join. But while we're waiting, please place your name, your organization, and why you're attending today's session in the chat. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Few more minutes. We're just going to wait. About 3:35, we're going to jump right into the conversation. Thank you, thank you, thank you for joining us. We're excited to have you all here today. Okay, so as you're coming in, again, place your name, your organization, and why you're attending today's session in the chat. Say hi to some friends, but we're going to go ahead and kind of jump into today's conversation. So we want to first start by thanking all of our Flood Center funders. We thank you for making this webinar and all the other work of the Flood Center possible. I also want to send a special thank you to our program coordinator, Malaysia McClendon, and our Flood Center fellow, Emma Miller, because they have worked very hard to make this webinar possible. They are part of our Forum and Flood Center team, so I just want to send a special thank you to them. I also want to thank our communication director, Lindsay Wagner. She will be tweeting for us today. So as usual, please join us in our conversation via Twitter. We appreciate all of our team members and just want to thank them as well as our funders. Thank you so much. I would not be who I am if I did not share my excitement about Dr. Townsend Smith joining the Flood Center as our first inaugural senior director. She is an amazing person and brings a lot of experience and expertise to the Flood Center. We are so excited to have her join us very, very soon. If you will, please join me in the chat by giving her congratulations. We thank her for all her work and are excited to have her come to the Flood Center. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Yes, congratulations to Dr. Townsend Smith. Okay, so as we go through today, I just want to provide you with a little schedule about how we're going to go about things. So, excuse that 3-4. Yes, so from 3:30 to 3:40, we're just going to welcome you in, and that's what we're doing right now. From about 3:40 to 4 o'clock, we're going to have an introduction and kind of setting the tone of today's discussion. From 4 o'clock to 4:40, we'll have our panel. And then from 4:40 to 4:55, excuse me, we'll have our closing of the panel and a Q&A so we can ask some questions to our panelists. If you have a question, please make sure you are putting that into the Q&A box, not in the comments, or excuse me, the chat. We want to make sure that we get all your questions. So please put that into the Q&A box. Then from 4:55 to 5 o'clock, we will be wrapping up and we will have an evaluation. If you are an educator and you need CEUs, please do our evaluation, complete our evaluation, and you will be sent a CEU certificate. The only way to get a CEU certificate is to complete our evaluation. All right, so again, please place your questions in the Q&A. Again, join us via Twitter to have this conversation. You see our hashtags and our tags up there as well. If you have a question, please put it in the Q&A and add any reflections that you have throughout the conversation in the chat. We have over 200 people joining us today, so the chat may go a little fast. We want you to engage, but please remember that this is a place where we encourage everyone to be respectful. We don't tolerate hateful remarks. So please just make sure that we are all colleagues and we treat each other with respect in the chat. Thank you so much. So now we're gonna go ahead and jump into our conversation. Today's session is called The History Lesson, Implication of Desegregation on the North Carolina Teacher Pipeline. So before we jump into our panel and our presentation, I do want to kind of set the tone of today's conversation a little bit for us. So I have provided a very brief, and I do mean brief, timeline on your screen right now from 1954, which was when Brown versus Board of Education, the decision came out, until 1974, which is when desegregation in North Carolina is complete. And I say complete with air quotes. We do know that there are some counties and districts where desegregation was a little bit slower. So this is a roundabout time. But something that I want you to remember that as we go throughout this conversation is that desegregation did not happen right when the Board of the Brown education decision came out. If you see on your screen, it is from 1954 to 1974. So this is 20 years that this all took place. And in between 1954 and 1970, when Dr. Flood, our namesake, went across the country to facilitate desegregation across the state, there were many instances of violence. And so you see pictures of Dorothy Count Scoggins on your screen, of the Little Rock Nine on your screen, and folks who are protesting desegregation. So this was not an easy process. This was not something that happened and it was celebrated by all. And just to let you know, desegregation generally refers to a legal or political process of ending racial segregation. So this was something that happened only by law, only by policies. It wasn't something that happened just out the goodness of our hearts. Just remember that as we go through this conversation, this was legally mandated. Also, we want to just remember that during this time, like I said, it was a lot of violence happening. In between 1954 and 1970, we had the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King and several other civil rights leaders. We have a lot of protests from folks who did not want desegregation to happen. We have a lot of folks who are entering schools and who are not wanted there. So with that comes along of the fact that you have to remember when desegregation happened, Black and Brown students were put into a situation where they were coming from segregated schools, which were not as resourced as white schools, but the educators there, they had a purpose and they had a mission. Many of the educators were, well, not many, excuse me, all of educators in segregated schools were either Black or Brown. And they had a mission to basically educate their students to succeed. And not that we don't have that today, but it was just a different experience because those educators knew the challenges and obstacles their students would face out in the world and getting jobs and being successful. They knew the racism that they would face, the violence that they would face. So they tried to empower their students to succeed in any way that they could. And that's when we say that desegregation, excuse me, I apologize. Desegregation happened, but integration never fully happened. We never fully integrated, because integration is a social process where members of racial groups experience fair and equal treatment within a desegregated society. And so as we know, currently today, we see a lot of inequities that are happening in our school systems, and that usually impacts our teacher pipeline and our educators. We'll talk a little bit more about how desegregation impacted educators of color when Emma comes to give her presentation, but I just wanted you to keep those things in mind. And I also want you to keep in mind that what we're saying is that desegregation was not bad, but it was not the full dream that we had. We really want integration, and that's what we're working towards. And that's what we try to do when we say we want educational equity for every student. We want every student to have equal access to educational opportunities. We want them to have the resources, such as educators, that they need to be successful in their own right. And with that being said, I want to introduce our Flood Center Fellow, Emma Miller. So Emma has worked tirelessly on a project that we had, and you will see later, it's called the North Carolina School Desegregation Timeline. And as I mentioned earlier, school desegregation was political, and it was a policy-led, legislative-led mandate. So she has put together a timeline that we are very excited to share with you later on in today's discussion. She has also worked to create a lit review of just outlining how policies were put into place and the impact that they had. So again, thank you for joining us, and I am excited to turn it over to Emma Miller.
Thank you so much, Ashley, and thank you everybody for coming here today. As Ashley introduced me, my name is Emma Miller, and I served as the School Desegregation Fellow for the Flood Center throughout the fall and kind of into the spring as well. I wanted to start off our session today with a quote from scholar and oral historian Jacqueline Dowd Hall in her article about long civil rights movement. Remembrance is always a form of forgetting, and the dominant narrative of the civil rights movement distorts and suppresses as much as it reveals. The landmark Supreme Court case of Brown versus Board of Education is often considered kind of the start of the civil rights movement. We use this date of 1954 to talk about the beginning of this movement, and we usually limit this movement from about 1954 to 1965 with the passage of the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act. But we know that this is a misconception. We know that the long civil rights movement stretched far back into the 1930s and had its roots in New Deal era policies, and extends to today with the Black Lives Matter movement and the racial injustices that we are still facing and fighting today in our schools and in our country. We've limited the civil rights movement to kind of this, 1 decade long of history fought by great men like Martin Luther King Jr., who just simply wanted us to all get along and be equals. And while this is not necessarily wrong, it is an oversimplification of the movement and an oversimplification of the difficulties, pain, sorrow, joy, and just abundance of feelings that came along with the movement. School desegregation was seen as this event that only had really positive effects. And while it did make more opportunities available for Black and Brown students all across the nation, it also came with a lot of hardship and loss, a lot of community sadness as the loss of schools. The reality of school desegregation is often not nearly as simplistic as we make it out to be. While it was beneficial with these educational opportunities, it was also, like I said, this period of hardship and strife. As schools closed, it wasn't just the closing of a school, but the closing of often cultural community centers, spaces where Black and Brown communities really gathered and had the heart of their community within these schools. Black teachers were put out of jobs immediately. Buildings were condemned. Trophies and awards and photos and yearbooks were kind of tucked away quietly in boxes and forgotten about as students moved forward in the name of progression, the name of a progressive movement, into schools that didn't necessarily always have their best interests in mind. And despite these kind of supposed educational benefits of desegregation, many couldn't help but feel like a large part of their identity was lost. And nowhere was this more true than in North Carolina. So the bulk of the burden of desegregation has always fallen on Black and Brown communities. They've always been the ones who have had a force to comply with these new regulations, whether that meant closing their schools, losing their jobs, and losing their sense of community. Black teachers began losing their jobs at alarming rates after Brown versus Board was passed. In 1954, there is an estimated about 82,000 Black educators that were serving over 2 million Black students. After this period of Brown versus Board of Education, more than 38,000 Black educators were dismissed from their positions. From 1975 to 1985, the number of Black students who chose to major in education when they went to college dropped by 66%. These are all really alarming rates as we kind of think about the future of Black education at this time. In the name of progression, in the name of bettering schools, we lost so many jobs and opportunities for Black educators and Black students. In North Carolina alone, the NAACP estimated that in the summer of 1964, over 500 Black educators lost their jobs. These teachers were kind of fired under the guise that because their schools were shutting down, they didn't have any opportunities for them to work. They weren't being hired at the white schools that students were often being funneled into, even though usually white educators who were often less qualified than the Black educators were being hired to kind of accommodate this new influx of students. Teacher preparation programs and kind of lack thereof made it difficult for any Black students who did want to be educators to gain licensure. At some historically Black colleges and universities, teacher programs were shut down entirely under the guise of spreading communism or other kind of faulty claims. This is the case at Allen State University in Columbia, South Carolina. Many Black teachers were also forced out of the profession due to licensure testing requirements. Minority teacher candidates overall were having disproportionately lower scores on these standardized tests, proving that they were tests that were not designed for all people to be successful. Thinking about these long-lasting impacts of Brown versus Board of Education, we typically think of this as a very positive Supreme Court case that brought a lot of benefits. And while it did bring a lot of benefits and kind of slowly began to desegregate our schools, it also resulted in a lot of loss and heartbreak. We kind of have this rose-colored view of the effects of the civil rights movement, and school desegregation have kind of clouded our historical memory. At a time when teaching an accurate depiction of our American history is coming under scrutiny and coming under fire, it is more important than ever to bring the real historical truths and memory to the forefront. Throughout my work as this Flood Center School Desegregation Fellow, I've tried my best to always honor these historical truths and honor the people who lived through these events. I've created this interactive multimedia timeline of not only school desegregation, but also school resegregation, as schools have continued, especially in North Carolina, to resegregate in the following decades after Brown versus Board of Education. In the aftermath of many districts in North Carolina declared unitary status, and kind of ending their policies of busing and using race within their school placement, schools began to resegregate to levels that were almost comparable to pre-Brown versus Board of Education. So this timeline is currently the most comprehensive account of national and state policies within North Carolina, resegregation and desegregation. And it aims to honor most of all the lived experiences of these people. It was most important for me to kind of reach out to those who made this work possible. I wouldn't be here today with this position without the wonderful Dr. Dudley Flood, who I had the honor of interviewing and preserving his life history and incredible work so that many generations to come would be able to hear his story and learn about his legacy. Many of the events on this timeline honor oral histories that have already been conducted from the Southern Oral History Program and other oral history organizations across the state to kind of honor these lived experiences and firsthand accounts of people who never got to tell their stories, of history books that have always excluded the narrative of those on the ground working at the grassroots level. I aim to, by using these oral histories, attempt to set straight the historical narrative. So we've organized the timeline kind of in chronological order, beginning in 1896 with the Plessy versus Ferguson case that began the racialized system of segregation under the guise of separate but equal being actually equal, and we know that it truly was not. We kind of go from 1896 all the way to 2021 with the most recent Leandro ruling in Leandro versus State of North Carolina, a Supreme Court case in North Carolina that kind of surrounds inequitable school funding. So dates that are specific to North Carolina are in blue. As you can see here, this is an example of in 1951 of UNC desegregating its law school. And there's an oral history clip that you could listen to and also an audio transcript for you to read along with if you are not able to listen to the clips. So all the dates specific to North Carolina are in blue, and then all of the national dates, like the Brown versus Board ruling exemplified here, are in yellow. So when you are going through the timeline yourself, you can kind of look through the dates and see the blue dates, North Carolina, yellow dates are for national events. And to view the timeline in its entirety, you can go to this link here, the forum, ncforum.org/North Carolina School Desegregation Timeline. So you can view the timeline in its full entirety there. And while this timeline does attempt to cover all of the most relevant cases and policies, considering school desegregation and resegregation, we know that it is not all encompassing, because if it was, this timeline would be so long that nobody would be able to really use it. And we really wanted this to be a very user-friendly experience. We wanted it to be accessible to elementary school students and educators trying to teach about the civil rights movement and desegregation, to scholars trying to finish their PhD programs and trying to learn more about the most important historical moments, and to somebody who might not have any prior historical knowledge could be able to go to this timeline and kind of review and understand the most important policies and cases. So while we do acknowledge that this is not a comprehensive timeline, if you go to the timeline link, there is a timeline date submission form at the bottom. If you feel like there is something absolutely crucial that we missed in this timeline, and you think that it is essential that we include it, you can request dates to be added to the timeline. If you want to review the sources that are associated with this as well, that will be available later within the resources tab on the Deadly Flood websites near the Student Voices resource page. In addition to the timeline, I also created a literature review that kind of covers the most important and most relevant literature from North Carolina's school desegregation and resegregation, and kind of the most important policies at the national and state level for this. This will also be available under the Student Resources tab in the Deadly Flood Center timeline, and it can be used kind of alongside the timeline or in its own right to learn more about the history of school desegregation and resegregation. And this project just truly would not be possible without the help of Jen Askew, Danita Masons-Hogans, Dr. Dudley Flood, and Sandra Conway. I'm also just incredibly indebted to all of those people, as well as Ashley and the rest of my colleagues at the forum. This project wouldn't be possible without your help and kindness and advice throughout this process. So I just wanted to say thank you all so much. I hope you enjoyed this resource, and now I'll turn it back over to Ashley to introduce our speakers.
First, I just want to again say I need all of us to just congratulate Emma on this project that she has created in the chat, because let me tell you something, this took time. Emma was working on this last year. It took time. She was very diligent in trying to make sure that we had input from a lot of historians, a lot of researchers. She put a lot of work into this, and we are so excited that she was able to create it. A lot of you have been putting in the chat how it would be a great resource for students. We would love for this resource to be for educators, policymakers, legislators as well. This is often something that we are not aware of. It's not that, you know, the resources aren't there, but they aren't easily accessible. So this is what we wanted this resource as a timeline itself and the literature review and the resource page to be. They're one click away. And as Emma said, there's no way that this is comprehensive. We acknowledge that we may have some blind spots in this. So if there is a date, a legislative document, a policy that needs to be here because it was influential. And also just a reminder, I know this is particularly to North Carolina's desegregation history. We know there is so much that happened across our country. So also just realizing that it is very specific to North Carolina. And we are very thankful for Emma and her work. So thank you again, Emma, for all that you have done. We appreciate you, and we appreciate this resource. The links for the resource are in the chat. If you need that, please let us know, and we will put it back in there. Now on to our speakers for today, because I am very excited for this conversation. In preparing for this conversation, we were we had some conversations with these speakers, and let me just tell you, I am never more humbled than when I talk to our namesake Dr. Dudley Flood, or when I talk to Danita Mason Hogans. We have so many folks who are our elders who have so much to offer us in terms of a historical perspective on where we've been and how we can move forward together. We just don't tap into them enough. So today we have Danita Mason Hogans as our moderator. She is going to lead us through this discussion. She is going to lead our panelists through this discussion. I have no doubt it is going to be full of just quotes that you all can use, full of action steps we can all use. I encourage you all again to just listen in and really listen to what they're saying, how they've been able to navigate this world, because they've had so many experiences that we can all learn from, so many lessons that we can all take into putting some of the issues that we're facing in education today. I'm very excited to have you join us today. Very excited for this conversation. So I am going to turn it over to Danita, and we're going to get our panelists up here. Thank you again for all joining us today.
Thank you, Ashley. Thank you so much for inviting me to participate today. Ashley is one of my very favorite people. I just want to thank you for all of the work that you do, and the folks over at the Flood Center. You have made this an excellent opportunity for us to learn and grow as educators. And I want to thank you for that. I want to thank Malaysia. And Emma, you did an excellent job on the timeline. And I appreciate so much you doing that for us. Lindsay, thank you for your facilitation. And I want to welcome Dr. Townsend as well. So I echo everyone who is welcoming Dr. Townsend. And I just want you to know that I'm so excited to speak with these wonderful pioneers who have really paved the path for those of us educators who are committed to providing a floor and a solid foundation for all of our children. So with that, we'll go ahead and get into the conversation. And the first question is for Dr. Floods or Ms. Count-Stroggins, but please feel free for anyone to answer a question. And the question is that it could be argued that desegregation has had a lasting impression on today's education system. In your opinion, what are 3 major impacts of desegregation on the teaching profession and education in general that we see today?
Ladies first.
So good afternoon, everyone. One of the things that, I have seen is we have less teachers, and we have less Black and brown teachers in the field that we had. When I listened to the presentation that Emma did, to see the numbers of Black and brown teachers that were not only exited the field, but also were displaced from the field of education. And so what does that mean? What does that mean for our children today? It means that our children don't see people in the classroom that look like them. So that's one of the things. The other is also desegregation, also the impact that it had on our teachers in the field, as we talked about the fact of them being educated and highly educated, where some of their white counterparts were not. But at the same time, when we look at positions that are available for them now in the field, they don't have the same opportunity to be able to exceed in the profession in the field. So those are two of the ones that I have seen. But of course, we know now that the resources that were available to our Black and brown children, to me, it reminds me so much of the way it was when I attempted to integrate schools in 1957. And so how can that be access to a high quality education for our children? Dr. Flood?
Thank you. There was there was an element of continuity between school and the rest of society prior to desegregation. So much so that in the school in which I began teaching, and in, by the way, the same school from which I had graduated, I knew every child's parent, I knew every child's background, and I knew where the needs were firsthand, and I had the notion that they had enough confidence in my expertise that when I said something to them, they took it quite seriously. So I knew that the provocation to move from where they were to where they could possibly go was as important as the math that I was teaching or the science or whatever else it was. And so there was that inculcation factor that I felt very free to do. I'm not certain that teachers felt, as a matter of fact, I'm certain they didn't feel free to do that as we moved into a different environment. First of all, there wasn't enough trust among the parents, and parents, kids bring to school whatever the parents have inculcated in them. Students don't invent very much in first grade. They do what they've been programmed to do. And one of the things they've been programmed to do was to have very little faith in the knowledge of people of color. And so you had to begin with ensuring that they ensuring that they understood that you had the capacity to do what you were there to do. Secondly, I didn't see myself as the sole avenue through which the education was derived. I thought there were other experiences to which they needed to be exposed beyond the classroom. So it's very common, and I was comfortable in doing that. By the way, I started teaching in 1955, back when the earth was cooling. And I felt very comfortable in going to a kid's house and saying, you and I need to have a conversation. I wasn't going to do that in front of his peers. I wasn't going to do that in a formal classroom setting. And my time was spent in helping him. Yes, you can. It isn't that you can, it's that you need to change your focus. You need to change your priorities. And that was accepted. Even now, half my kids still call me daddy. You know, half of the kids I taught 40, 50, I get Father's Day cards from them. Because when you come into my class saying, well, I don't have a father, well, you didn't until you got there. You got one now, also. So don't play that game with me. You got all the father you will ever need right here. And that extended you beyond the classroom. And then finally, we had a support system which we had accumulated from other entities, the faith-based community and communities. You know, Boy Scouts were in my school. Programs that would normally not be in school today were in my school, so we didn't differentiate. While I was a teacher, I was also a Boy Scout master. I was a 4-H club leader. And one hat didn't get in the other way of those because their continuity, we recognized that was more. And that is not at the expense of classroom lesson, by the way. Because back then we used to have something called homeroom. We had 20 minutes at the start of school in which a cadre of kids were assigned to me specifically, to every teacher. And in that we did what one might have done at home. We were aware of the law, but we also realized that the law said that we were in loco parentis. That means in the place of parent. And I exercised the prerogative that a parent would have been exercising had they had the capacity and capability and all that was needed to do so. And so that's just a few of the things that we might have sacrificed because we didn't. And by the way, they were portable. We simply weren't able to. We were simply able to take them with us.
Well, Mr. Vickers and Dr. Lowery, we know that school desegregation was a pivotal time for Americans. And it was a step towards breaking down systemic barriers and oppression. As we've all reckoned with racist policies, laws, and systems how can school systems learn from the mistakes during desegregation efforts and use this learning to address issues of educational inequities? And what impact do you think that'll have on the teaching profession and students?
Ladies first.
Okay, thank you. I know that being a teacher, starting as a new teacher in 1970, students were angry because they had to leave schools, and dealing with that, as Dr. Flood said, I did, and other teachers did a lot more than teacher content. I taught students, and I was trying to help people deal with the anxiousness they were experiencing, the long bus rides, some of them just to get to the school where I was, an hour there and an hour back. And the anger that they were feeling, I worked with them on that, my students. And teachers who were experiencing that kind of anger. In our system, we had 3 of everything, where other systems probably had 2. And folks were not happy with the way the desegregation plan for our school system was happening. And teachers were highly respected when I started teaching. If you said you were a teacher, it was kind of like you were in the presence of someone really special. And that's what I've seen disappear over time, from my own time being in education. I was there for 33 years, to even today, where I am encouraging a niece to stick with her teacher track. She has other family telling her, you don't want to be a teacher. You don't want to do that. You don't want to go into education. There's not a lot of money and that kind of stuff. So I'm forever working with groups in my church and our community, worked with the Teaching Fellows program for a long time, recruiting people to follow a teacher education track at their college, wherever it was. And I can remember one young lady, she said, Miss Joanne, you want everybody to be a teacher. I said, I sure do, darling. Everybody should have a good teacher. And that's what I want. But getting the respect for the profession back in focus, and that kind of decision will help young people who want to be teachers but are afraid, well, I can't live on that salary, or I'm going to deal with a lot of foolishness in a school that I shouldn't have to deal with. But, you know, we're more than teachers when we're there. We are parents. I wasn't a scoutmaster, but I was a drama club, worked with the drama club. I worked with pageants. I worked with the barbecue plate sales we did to raise money. We did all kinds of things to get what we needed to survive in our school. So I'm proud of my profession. I'm proud of being a product of public education and being a teacher from a long line of teachers on my father's side. And I'm going to use Dr. Flood's phrase about being a 5th grade alumni, I'm sorry. My mama was a 2nd grade alumnus. She dropped out of school to be a washerwoman for some of the folks in our town. So that's my phrase from now on. And I'm going to encourage all the time in every arena of my life, people to go into teaching. We need teachers. Students need to see people who look like them. When they're being told, well, you have to read this paragraph so we can see if you sound like what we want to send out into the schools. Well, when that stuff was going on, they were not seeing anybody on the panel making the decision who looked like them. And I worked real hard to get rid of that stuff, and it went away real quick. So that, supporting our teachers, supporting them politically in terms of salaries and restoring the benefits that they used to have in education, all of that needs to happen and put us back, I say, at the top of all the professions, because we wouldn't have all the other ones if we didn't have teachers.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
What are your thoughts, Mr. Vickers?
Oh, good afternoon to you all, and thank you for inviting me today. I bring a little bit different perspective because I was not an educator. I was a student, and I had the opportunity to go to both segregated and desegregated schools. But half my half my education was done in a segregated school from 1st to 6th grade, and then from there on in a desegregated school. From my perspective, a lot of what Dr. Flood and Ms. Lowery have said, I got to see. It was much different going from one school to the other. One of the things that these great educators on the line here have not mentioned was how much the encouragement was just for having them there in the classroom. We experienced the encouragement from them, as I mentioned, the stick-to-itiveness and drive, you can do this, you definitely can make it through this. We got started out when schools desegregated, a lot of things, in my opinion, just went crazy. Very first thing they did was they started taking, as we know, they started taking Black kids out of their neighborhoods and busing them to other schools. Well, along with the long drives and all the other things that had to go on, there was the loss of community. The reason that I think so much was lost in the respect for teachers, respect for the profession and so forth, was because by the time they got to that end of that long bus ride, the people who were meeting them there when they stepped out the bus, whether they look like them or not, were not necessarily encouraging, loving, if I can say that, kind of influences for them. So that was one thing. One of the other things that went on was when I began to understand what the civil rights movement was about, it was to make sure that we had equality. We wanted the same thing they had in the other schools. They weren't going to give them to us, so we were going to have to go to their schools. But we still are wanting those same things, those same equalities. I want my grandkids, now that my kids are out, I want my grandkids to be able to have all the same opportunities. That the level field, we talk about a lot, that the level field, that the playing field be level. And there's lots of reasons that it's not. Again, I'm not an educator. I'm a retired IT professional. So, my perspective is ones and zeros. It is and isn't, right? But there's so many things that got taken out. And just one last comment, a thing that's going on today, and I see more and more of this. There was just a story on the other day. Our schools, along with our teachers, used to be integral to the community. They were what bound the community together and the people together. Well, now those schools that were standing in the 50s and 60s and 70s have become just decrepit, rundown buildings in the middle of a community, as opposed to putting money back in. I'm not necessarily an advocate for segregating schools, but the school is there in the community. And that's how you get to know the people around you. And that's how you get to see the teachers coming up and say, you know what, I want to be like them. I want to be like, one of them in my community. There's so many things, but those are just a couple of the big things that leapt out at me. And as far as, how it impacted, I can see how it impacted the teacher pipeline, because I'm sure it was more than just the money. Again, I was looking at it from a young teenager perspective, but a lot of the teachers I know had a particular passion ingrained in them to do this, whether it was from family or seeing other teachers or whatever. You lose that, but you have lost that, just as I lost some of the passion for the kind of friendships and relationships that I had across the different school lines. I'm sure teachers were going through that same kind of thing with their colleagues. We know with their students, and definitely with the politicians and administrators who were running the system, as it were. So those would be my initial comments.
Well, Mr. Vickers, thank you for that. And as Dr. Lowery alluded to, prior to desegregation, being an educator was a prominent profession among Black and Brown communities. However, now the state and nation are experiencing a lack of diversity in the teaching workforce. And I was just wondering, based on your experience, why do you think this is the case? And what do we need to do to recruit and retain Black and Brown educators? And I would love for you also to weigh in on this, Ms. Counts-Goggins.
Well, thank you. Well, first of all, I'd like, of course, I like Dr. Vickers. I'm not an educator per se. I didn't teach in the classroom, but I did work in the early childhood field. I started that field when I graduated from college. I worked as a social worker initially, and for abusing or neglected children in New York City. I saw what was happening to children then, and that's when I chose to work in the field of early childhood. And I worked in that field for 40 years because my thought was that children need to learn at an early age, the acceptance. And so I ended up teaching teachers in the early childhood field as well as administrators, because I felt by the time these kids got into public school, I wanted them to be able to have what was the necessary education that they need to have to be successful. But I grew up in a family of educators. So education for me has always been stressed. My father was a college professor at Johnson C. Smith University. I lived on that campus for 16 years as a child growing up. And I have a long line of educators in my family, aunts, uncles. And because at that time, as we talked about earlier, that was a profession for Black and Brown people that were graduating from college. But one of the things that I see now is that a lot of our institutions that had teaching programs no longer have those. And as Dr. Lowery talked about the fact of encouraging people in the field to be able to go into education, a lot of kids coming in today have chosen not to go into that field. So we have to continue to do that. But at the same time, the education field needs to be available for them when they go into that and go into that college. And I can think in terms of, I graduated from Johnson C. Smith University. Johnson C. Smith University was built to be able to educate, teachers back in the era over 160 years ago. I think in terms of my class, how many of us people graduated in my class went into the teaching field, but no longer now there is an education program at Johnson C. Smith University. So what happens is that a lot of the HBCUs across the country, the same kind of thing is happening. So we're not producing the teachers for our Black and Brown children, and that's hurting our kids. The work that I've done, basically, I'm on an advocacy role. And I work with a lot of the schools, especially in the area in which I live. And these are low performing schools. And when I go into those classrooms and I see that the children that are in those schools, a lot of them don't have teachers that look like them. What are we going to do to be able to ensure that the children have those kind of experiences as well? So.
Well, I want to go back. Thank you so much, Dr. Counts-Goggins. I want to go back to you just for a second, Mr. Vickers, because I know that you entered into the school system, and I wonder what difference do you think it would have made had we not lost approximately 75% of our Black educators when you went to the school? What impact and what difference do you think that would have made your transition easier, and why do you think that might be important?
It would have made the transition, well, first of all, let me just say that were it possible, I would likely not have transitioned. When we spoke the other day, Dr. Dudley mentioned the fact that, that was a time when your parents say, this is where you go to school and that's where you go. So they said, you're going to school down there. And I'm like, well, okay. But in terms of making it easier, it would have, because resource-wise, the only real difference that was, excuse me, I shouldn't say only, the major difference that was missing was the resources. We were, out of our communities were coming great Black doctors and lawyers and, teachers, of course, and every profession. We were turning out the people. What we didn't have was the resources that when we stepped out, that we could step out onto a level playing field. We had to start out running uphill before we got to the flat part of the field where we could equally compete, as it were. And many never reached that. As Dr. Scoggins said there, it is, it's terrible that we're losing so many teacher programs in HBCs when we see the disconnect that's going on. So it would not have been, it still would have been a bit of a difficult transition just because the resources were different, because they'd had, in my particular case, when I went there in the 6th grade, they'd had a 5-year running head start on me and learning things that I had to catch up on. Were that not the case, were we able to have those same resources at Lincoln when I was at Lincoln High School there in Chapel Hill? When I was there, it would have been a walk in the park, okay? Again, because there was nothing educationally, if I can use my air quotes now, that we lacked. We just didn't have the materials to kind of, and the resources to catch up with where they were. I hope that addressed what you were asking.
No, that was great. Thank you so much for that, Mr. Vickers. And, just to kind of continue that train of thought, I think it was Dr. Lowery and Dr. Flood who kind of touched on this. Dr. Flood was talking, I think, about, and Dr. Lowery talking about the nurturing environment that they thought it was important to impart with the children. And so we know that teachers are the most important school-related factor in influencing student outcomes. So I'm interested, Dr. Lowery, Dr. Flood, on your thoughts on how we can utilize lessons from desegregation to prepare and support educators to ensure that they are creating inclusive, anti-racist, and just environments for student success.
You want me to go first?
Yes, ma'am, that's fine.
Thank you. I know, again, from my own experience, that nurturing and being available to students, I didn't make the home visits like Dr. Flood spoke of, but being available to those parents. And I had parents say to me, well, if my child was such and such a school, he could go to college. And of course, you don't know me, but I would snap back, not in a mean way. I would just say, he can go to college from this school if you're willing to support him in what he needs to do or she needs to do. And those experiences helped me be a better person, be a better student. I wanted to, again, I wanted everybody to be a teacher. I came from a community where we were segregated into 3, and the Black students went out of town to school, and the white students went out of town to school, and the Indian students stayed in the town. But I saw the books my older brothers and sisters had with 7 and 8 names. There are old books, somebody's old books were our new books, that kind of thing. But that's not, it did not mean to me that a student had to be ashamed of where they were going to school or embarrassed by the fact that they were at School X, and right down the road, 3 miles from our school was School Y, that were all the resources were available. All the resources you could imagine were available, and we didn't have them. So we had to do things, on our own to get them. But having role models that students see, I had them in my church. Half my church, the people who were professional, were teachers, and some of them were my teachers. And having respect for those individuals, and I became a teacher because of 2 teachers that I had in school that were in my church as well. I wanted to be like those folks, and I wanted to teach. So being that role model all the time, wherever we find ourselves, and representing our profession is one of the things that will help us draw students of color back into education, offering them opportunities for resources. I know housing, stipend money, all kinds of things like that's available to students in my community now that was not available to me or to the generation even after me. But that's something that has to be highlighted and something that has to be shared, and things that students have to know about resources. And I see that as a shortcoming in some areas, but just seeing people who are proud of being teachers. One of my 3 children is a teacher. One's a teacher, one's a scientist, and one's doing something in Washington with the government. I'm never quite sure what, but anyway, they're all good people. But I'm very proud that I have a teacher. One of mine is a teacher, and she influences other young people to become teachers. And I'm just, finding ways to help them, even if they're older students, to maneuver and get a degree and become a teacher. And it's all paid for so that they're not struggling with part-time jobs and that kind of stuff. We have that available at our institution where I live. And I don't know how much of that's available to students elsewhere.
Well, thank you so much for that. What do you think, Dr. Flood? I think you might be on mute, Dr. Flood.
Yes, I was on mute. And I know James Ford is saying you sounded better when you're on mute. But let me assure you that I agree with everything Dr. Lowery said. But in addition to that, I've always believed that heroes matter. And all my heroes were teachers, every single one of them. There were people about whom I had heard, but they're not my heroes. They did spectacular things. I heard about Jackie Robinson. I heard about, I played a little baseball, but I couldn't be Jackie Robinson. But I could be Sherman Jones, who played in the dirt league, and I could touch him. I could show there and touch him. Now, if you haven't looked much farther than the end of your dinner table for a hero, you're starting with a problem to start with. And Dennis McCaskill, who was the first male teacher. I didn't have a male teacher until I got in the 10th grade. All my teachers were women teachers. And so I was looking as I, and Stanley reminds you, my father was an alumnus of the 5th grade, a fine man, but there were certain things he wasn't able to teach me. And there were instances that had very little to do with the geometry Mr. McCaskill was teaching. Although I did learn his geometry very, very well, still know how to make a 5-pointed star. Very few people know how to do that. But in addition to that, Mr. McCaskill would come by and say, "Dudley, let me see your clean handkerchief." And I said, "What's that got to do with geometry?" You'll go along better if you always have a, do you know to this minute, I don't go anywhere without a clean handkerchief. He said, "Get some long socks that go over your calf." My dad wore gumboots. I never seen anybody with long socks that went over. There's more to education than schooling. And I think we've confused the fact that schooling and education are equal. They aren't, they're not the same thing. Education extends, schooling provides you with an opportunity to learn how to get an education. I've been to school some part of every year since I was 5 years old. But most of what I know, I learned somewhere other than in school, most of it. Now, that isn't to say that what I learned at school wasn't the driver, because had I not had the schooling, I could not have capitalized on the other environments. But I think we have confused something about what teachers ought to be and do. I think we've begun to dictate what you can and cannot do. And so spontaneity has gone out of our profession. I taught because I always thought that great teachers teach because they can't help it. I still believe that. Great teachers teach because they can't help it. And I couldn't help teaching. And I said, if I'm going to teach, I might as well get paid for it, because I know I'm going to teach wherever I am. If I'm awake, I knew that when I was 7, 8, 9 years old. And so the inspiration of having a forum on which to legitimately teach. And then if you're going to teach, you ought to know something. So then the impetus is you better learn something so you'll have something to teach. All those were they preceded anything called your profession. The other thing that was so interesting to me is that all the teachers that I knew owned a home. I've always had great value in owning a home because when I was a small child, my folk rented. And I always knew that in any given day, the landlord could say, you know, you got to go somewhere else. And I said, that's not gonna happen to me. I'm gonna own a home. And then I also realized that there was a job at which I could dress. I always wanted to be dapper.
All right now.
And you may see me hungry, you may see me, you won't see me ragged. You're just not gonna see that. And that's because I grew up ragged. You know, I grew up with 2 pairs of pants. Now, not just me, I'm talking about the culture in which I was. There are many people. Now, if we have these incentives before us and they can be met, and we know how much is enough. Now, I've always wanted to be rich, but not really badly. I want to have a living where when I walk into a restaurant, I don't want to have to look at the right-hand side and see what it costs before I order. School teaching provides that. I've never had to worry about the next meal. I've never had to say, well, I'd like a steak, but I got to have pork. Teaching provides that. And let me tell you something right now. I haven't hit a lick of work for money. And the last, I don't know when, but every 25th of every month, the state deposits in my bank account more money than I need. So why don't we tell teachers that? I don't need anything other than what teaching provided for me. So as long as we hide that from people, as long as we only talk about the bad spot in school, how in the world are you going to recruit somebody to come into the profession? If they knew what I knew about teaching, they'd be lining up to get into teaching. Because I have friends who worked in other avenues which made 3 or 4 times the money I made, but right now they don't know what their 401k is going to do. They don't know what the Wall Street money is. We don't talk about the right things, folks. If we want to make this a glowing profession, we have to talk about those things that we know for a fact are critical to people. Not what they like, what is critical to them. Critical to people is, first of all, they want to be able to think. I never met anybody who didn't want to be able to think. So I want my students to know if you come in here, you're going to learn to think. And if you learn to think, you'll need less of me. You'll need less of anybody because you will make decisions and you'll be able to. Secondly, you need to know the fundamentals of how the political system works. You need to know the fundamentals of that because you live in a political system. You live and die in it. Your birth certificate was a political document. Your death certificate. So from the womb to the tomb, you will be in a political system. So whether anybody tells me I can teach politics or not, they got to be kidding me. I'm going to teach politics. My subject matter was mathematics. At one point was English, but I taught the political system. You got to know that. And then I taught the economic system. Even when I taught in middle school, I taught the economic system. And I had you to understand that the distinction between being well off and not so well off is a thing called surplus. You have to create more than you need, and you have to make a use of the West that's economically to your advantage. And I taught those little kids, even in the middle school, go out and get your shoe shine box. I still have my shoe shine box. I could hold it up now. And shine, don't shine the socks. You do it better than anybody else does it. Whatever you do better than everybody else does it, you'll get money for it. And so these are things that I don't know that are being taught. As a matter of fact, fairly certain they aren't. And the reason is because you've been dictated to what you can teach, how much of it, what you may not teach. And they would fire me if I were teaching that. because I'm gonna, kid asked me a question, if I know the answer, I'm gonna give it to him or her. whatever the penalty is. I'd rather get forgiven later on. But and so we've moved away from having the dignity that a teacher has to have to be effective. He or she has to have the latitude to do what he or she knows works with this particular cadre of youth. In the 12 years, I thought I never had two classes alike. And I hear my fellow teachers sometimes, this is the worst class I had. Hold on a minute. You might have been the worst class your teacher had. Come off of that. Because you're going to discourage somebody from going into our profession. But I didn't have any worst class. I had some episodes I would like to do without, but you don't categorize your class in that fashion. So those are just a few of the things I think were lost. And none of these were peculiar to me. I'm sharing them with you. Many people who were in black schools shared those concerns, and they shared them with me as a child. I heard those things, and they weren't sending me off to be a teacher. They were saying things that were peculiar to their experience, and I heard them, and I said, you know, that sounds like what I want to do and be. So I think we can solve a lot of our problems if we were to utilize the techniques that encourage people to see the good side of what we do. And it didn't brag. And Dizzy Dean said, if you can do it, it ain't bragging. And I agree with that. We need to talk about how we can make this work. And we know because we shall have made it work.
Well, I appreciate so much what you just shared with us, Dr. Flood. You began your talk in this last portion with talking about how you view teachers as heroes. And I just want you to know, I'm sure I'm speaking for all of my friends who are watching today. Y'all are all heroes for us and have laid the foundation in so many ways for us. And I appreciate, as an oral historian, I appreciate you sharing your stories. And Dr. Lowery, in particular, I don't know that we have enough information about Native folks and the integration or desegregation of Native children in the school systems. What are your thoughts on that, and how important do you think it is that we document some of these stories in history so that we can learn from them?
Oh, I think that all that needs to be, I say, written down, because I've seen people talk about it without information, without knowing, without having gone through the struggle. And, you know, kids need to just, you know, straighten up, get used to it. And I saw schools, people march at schools that were predominantly Indian schools, because their children had to leave that school and go to another community. And I shared about the young men from a school system that was within a city limits that came to the high school where I taught, because they weren't allowed to go to the school there. And we have to write that. Someone has to tell our story. Someone has to be part of that. I've been part of and I'll just share this as a point of one way that a group of women, one young lady that I taught in high school, wanted to tell her story about being in school during desegregation and the impact it had on her life. So she asked a group of women, you know, can we tell our stories? So we wrote our stories, someone scripted our stories, and we did a production at a regional theater two summers ago. And we told our stories about our teachers and about the schools and about one young lady who was there during desegregation and the friends that she developed. And she said that come from the support that came from the teachers who were in that school. I was, I can remember opening the fall of 1970, and there were teachers there who had been reassigned. They still came to that school every day in defiance of being reassigned to other schools. And we have to tell our stories, because it's not in the books. No one's going to write about it. And I'm still amazed at my own learning process about all the things that have been created, invented, developed by people of color in this country that it's not in the books. I checked the books. My grandchildren, 2 in high school and 1 in elementary. Some of those things aren't in the books, and they surely aren't in the books about our folks at any level. So we have to tell our own stories, and that I'm so proud of that production that that we were able to tell our stories. And you know, everybody has a story. And if it's not shared, if it's not written down, if there isn't some history that's documented and shared, and I talk a lot these days about decolonizing. It's probably not a popular term, but I use it. Decolonizing our thinking, our way of living, deciding that a certain standard is the way we have to talk, or the way we write, or the way we do things. I said, that's because the people controlling that were the people writing the books, creating the education system. And I've been sharing since we talked earlier in the week. Dr. Flood said about education was never supposed to be for people of color. It was not. It was never supposed to be for people of color. And again, I still encounter in my life, and this is 2022, folks who still think that way. And they talk about brown-skinned people and all of that, and talk about borders. I didn't know that certain areas had borders. And I said, well, you know, I use a reference. A friend of mine, she lives in Canada, I consider her a friend, said, you know, we don't cross the borders crossed us. So we were able to travel and move as a nation of people all over the country, all over. And then all of a sudden, here was a border that said you can't go any further than this. Our teachers and our teachers in the future have to have a broader sense of who they are, not just locally, that's important, but that our young people will find themselves in all parts of the world. And they need to know that you can develop relationships, you can have lasting relationships, and you can have them with your teachers. And those were my heroes. My teachers were my heroes. And I had male teachers from the 4th grade on up. I had a few ladies in high school, but you know, that was my experience. I just thought every school around had male teachers like we had, but I learned later they did not. So we do have to be more than just a teacher, and more than teaching a subject. I taught students. I taught English to students. I did not teach English. And I heard that phrase oftentimes from some of my colleagues. Well, they have to get it or they just won't make it. Well, they're still people and they still have needs. So that's me. I'm going to push public education forever.
I know you will. I know you will. And we appreciate it too.
Thank you.
We do have a few minutes for the friends who are watching to have a couple of questions for our panelists. So if you have any questions that you'd like for us to answer, please just put them in the chat. And one of the questions that popped up for the panelists has to do with mental health awareness. I know when I was coming up, and perhaps when you were too, I don't know that we really examine the impact of mental health awareness on the things that children have to go through and are subjected to in schools. We were usually told just to kind of tough it out. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on mental health courses centered around wellness skills to help people, young people, to regulate their nervous systems and, you know, to prepare them to hear the truth about our stories and our position in this place.
If I may, that was one of the things that the homeroom class that I made reference to earlier. That's exactly what its purpose was, because it wasn't unusual for a parent to come to me as a teacher and say a simple thing, you know, my kid, don't let anybody shout at him because he's nervous. Now that's the language that they knew. And I'm saying to myself, this kid ain't had no nerve-wracking experiences in my class, but if she sees some indications that she can't label, because I can label them and I understand what she's talking about, then I don't say to her something derogatory, I say, well, we'll deal with that. And so I know what I have to do is to figure out what are the things to which he is responding. If she is responding, they may be bullets, somebody may be bullying them, somebody may be doing something untoward toward them, or it may just be that they're insecure. And any child of color who wasn't insecure when I grew up, I don't know what he was taking. He was taking something that I didn't get any of. So insecurity was most often the mental thing I was dealing with. And we know how to make a person feel more secure. Have them to know they're cared about. Have them to know that if you fall, they're gonna catch you. You're not gonna stay down there. I mean, simple little stuff like that. But I don't know that I would feel comfortable now in the environment in which we were. I'd rather turn that over to a person who is authorized, and I didn't say certified because I'm as good at that as anybody else. But I'm not authorized to do it. I'm not authorized to counsel in that way because I don't have a master's in counseling. It doesn't matter that I have 55, 60 years experience in counseling. I have a master's in it. So I could be sued for doing exactly what you asked me that I do extremely well. That's one of the problems we have now. We've categorized stuff in a way that this is your little stable here, stay in it, don't cross that line. And we're wasting talent. We're absolutely wasting talent. It goes back to your earlier question about what we would have done differently. That would have been better when we desegregated schools. If we had utilized the resources that we had, because there was somebody that left a Black school and went there and took something out of that school that would have been very useful to that school. But it was not accessed, it was not employed, it was not put to work. When I was principal of a Black school and I brought white teachers in, I asked them to help me with the culture here, to understand what is it that might make this a better situation for any of the children as you react with them and as they react with you. And that opened the line for them to say to me, oh, by the way, I haven't been around Black folk much, and you need to help me understand it. Okay, that's reciprocal. But you got to invite that. If you don't invite that, you're not going to get it. You just have to be pretty arrogant, just walk in and start advising somebody. But when you open that door, so there were many resources like that had they allowed, they be in the school structure, allowed to be taken in and expanded the culture. That's what integration is about, expanding the culture so that there is nobody who doesn't fit somewhere in it who doesn't say, this is mine. Not, this is y'all's culture, this is mine, this is our culture. It has to be broadened. That's the only excuse I can give you for ever trying to integrate anything, is to broaden the culture so that everybody has a place in it. And everybody else is supportive of him being himself in that environment, in that place. And that's what I don't see happening now.
Well, I tell you, I'm sorry, did you say?
Can I, as the non-expert, take about just 30 seconds?
Well, you are an expert. You go ahead, Mr. Vickers.
One of the, our eldest daughter is a teacher, so I get a chance to have a lot of discussions with her. And one of the things that I have seen that has changed over time, even in our discussion from my experiences, teachers do not get to teach. The comment about how do we help them with mental health, how do we help them get fed, how do we help them get clothes, how do we make sure they have a home to go to, all those things are important, yes, but teachers don't get to teach. They are handling a lot of other social, economic, and other issues.
True.
And I think that is a disheartening factor when you're talking to new prospective teachers. They're looking at the fact that, in a public school, I got to take whoever walks in the door. I don't get a chance to choose like they would in a private school or whatever. And when they come here, for me to prove my ability, and obviously I'm oversimplifying here, but for me to prove my ability, they got to pass this test. Well, if they got to pass this test and I got to teach them how to pass that test, I don't get a chance to sit down and tell them, young man, you are not coming in this class with your pants hanging off. You're not going to disrespect that little girl sitting next to you. And you are definitely not going to disrespect me standing at the front of the class. That's the kind of stuff that, I mean, amongst all the other things that teachers teach, along with having to teach, history from like 600 or 700 years ago, and how to add 2 and 2 and always come up with 4, no matter how you do it, and that the world is not flat, it actually is round. I mean, all of that stuff they got to teach. And now we've thrown, I think it is just taken, I think all of this, culture and society has taken the focus off teachers being able to actually teach. And so many parents and so many institutions have abdicated all of what they should be doing to the people who stand in front of their kids 5, 6, 7, 8 hours a day. So I know it's a little longer than 30 seconds. Thank you for hearing me out. But I just, I had to say that it's just teachers don't, I even hear it from these professionals here. They don't really have time to teach. They got time to parent, and they got time to mental health, and they got time to PE, and they got time to mother and father. But so back on me.
I can't help but smiling and just going off in my head as to what would it have been like to go to school with you, Mr. Vickers, or with you, Dr. Count Scroggins, to be in one of the programs, the many programs you have for young people, or to be taught under Dr. Joanne Lara Call, I have a daddy, but I would have two with Dr. Flood. So just really thinking about all of the wonderful ways that y'all have impacted young people, and how much of a benefit it would be to have people of your ilk, your experience, and most of all your care to be empowered to educate our children. So that kind of segues into another question that we got from the audience, and I think it will probably be our last question that we're able to entertain. And Ashley could probably give direction on that. But the question is, what advice would you give to minority teachers who still face bias / racism in their schools? And how do we keep hope alive while facing issues so many years later? And that's the last question. And anyone who wants to offer hope to this wonderful group of educators, please feel free.
I'll start it off. We have spent a lot of time talking about what was, but one of the things I noticed in each of these great professionals, they talked about what needs to be and the way it should be going forward, so that 20 years from now, 30 years from now, we're not sitting here having discussions about the same issues that we're having in 1954. So encouragement, I would tell them to keep their eye on the prize. Those little, skulls that are sitting in front of them that they are educating, whatever that ends up being.
Well, I'm just full, and I hope that the folks watching this panel, and judging by the comments in the chat, y'all poured into us today. And we definitely appreciate it. It's been an honor and a pleasure to speak with y'all, to get to know you a little bit better. Ashley, thank you again for your just logistical facilitation, just perfect. And we, you know how much I appreciate you. And I'm gonna turn it over to Ashley now, and I'd just like to end again with gratitude.
So I just want to thank you all for being a part of this conversation. Again, I'm never more humbled than when I hear you all speak. These are the folks that we need to tap into. I just want to reiterate something that everyone has said, is that we have a lot of conversations about what the problem is. We have a lot of conversations about what happened, how it was back then. And this conversation was really to gain wisdom from where we've been to move forward. So the problem that we need to address is, how do we move forward? I heard a lot of different things, like, in our community, storytelling is everything. So I just want, when you listen to these folks talk and you hear someone say about how we need to invest into HBCUs to prepare our teachers, that's a thing that we can take and use and run with. And I know we have the Teacher Fellows program, and we've added some HBCUs there, but those are things that we need to capitalize on. Understanding the fact that we came from schools that were not resourced whatsoever, but they still had this mission-driven focus. And that's something that a lot of our educators are not given, because they have to deal with so much that is going on in the world today. And I think someone else said something about how we have legislated what a teacher is or what they're supposed to do in the classroom, and they're not able to bring in their community assets, engaging parents, in what we're doing to be educators. So again, these are historical lessons that we need to learn and we need to build upon to move forward. So I just want to thank you all for being a part of this conversation. Danita, thank you so much for moderating it. Just the way you talk is very calming and it moves me forward. It just makes me feel like I'm sitting talking to my mom and my grandma, my grandparents. Like I feel very much like family. Thank you all for attending today. Again, this is something that we could have had a whole series on itself. This is a huge topic. We were having a discussion earlier and everyone was like, we got to really kind of focus in on a couple questions because we could have 30,000 questions and still be having this conversation. So we want to continue to engage you all in this conversation as we move forward. And we do plan on engaging our speakers as we move forward. So again, thank you for all attending. If you please will fill out our evaluation. We want to make sure that these experiences are getting to everyone they need to get to. I have posted the evaluation link in the chat and you can take that. If you need a CEU, you can do that as well. This recording will be available on the Flood Center website. Please give us till tomorrow so that we can get it uploaded and everything. But on our Flood Center resources, we do have the timeline available and we want you to check that out, share it across your different networks. We do have the literature review that Emma has taken her time to create. That is also available. We also will be having, if you don't know about our speakers, if you don't know some of the history that they have been a part of, Stanley Vickers and Desegregating Chapel Hill, Dorothy Count Scoggins, of course, Dr. Flood, Joanne Lowery. We want you to learn as much as possible and we will be posting resources to just learn more about them and their work, but also just to recognize that these are just a few folks that we still have access to who have this experience. I encourage everyone to do their own research and to tap into these folks. So thank you again for coming. Please fill out the evaluation. And we're gonna wrap it up for today.
Okay. Thanks,
Thank
Ashley.
you. Bye. Fast.